Welcome, everyone. This is Dean Leander Harding and a special edition of the Dean's Forum tonight. This is the second talk by Dr. Carol Zaleski. She's been talking to us about Christian hope, the life eternal, near-death experiences, the resurrection of the body. And tonight, this is the second talk in the series. The topic tonight is going to be landscapes or visionscapes of the afterlife. Dr. Zaleski has a PhD from Harvard University, and she's a professor of religion at Smith College, widely published. If you can find her books and books about the afterlife, and also with her husband, she wrote a very wonderful book about the Inklings, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, in that crowd. I want to remind everybody that these talks are made possible by a partnership between the Cathedral of All Saints, the Cathedral of the Episcopal Church in the City and Diocese of Albany, and the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, which is the Roman Catholic Cathedral. My colleague and friend, Father David Lefort, who is the rector of the Roman Catholic Cathedral, wishes that he could be here. He can't be with us, but he sends his warmest greetings, and we're so very grateful to him and to the cathedral staff for their help and support in making these talks possible. It just so happens that today, as we're recording this talk, is June 16th. Today, as we're recording this talk, it's the 33rd anniversary of the covenant between the two cathedrals, so very groundbreaking in this day. We're so very pleased to have Dr. Zaleski back with us tonight and looking forward to what she has to say about landscapes of the afterlife. Dr. Zaleski.
Thank you, Dean Harding. And it's wonderful to hear about the covenant and to celebrate the anniversary of this covenant between All Saints and the Immaculate Conception. That seems a very fitting covenant indeed, and it's great to be virtually visiting you. So last time we were talking about fundamental questions having to do with whether it's reasonable to believe in eternal life. And I suggested that there are some reasonable philosophical arguments for the immortality of the soul, but that they're not conclusive knockdown arguments. And in any case, they aren't the sure foundation of Christian hope. That for Christians and Jews alike, the hope for eternal life is anchored, first of all, in our status as creatures. And that's interesting because our status as creatures is not one that on the face of it inspires confidence in eternal life and immortality, because we're made of dust. But the difference is, of course, that we're dust with dignity. We're stamped with the divine image and likeness. And so there is reason from within our tradition, not a generic philosophical idea, but we have reason to trust that our Creator didn't design us with death in mind. And there are hints of this in the Hebrew Bible. The rabbis who formed classical Judaism, as they read the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, they saw in there signs that point toward the hope for the bodily resurrection and the restoration of Israel. There's a great book about this, by the way, by scholar of the Hebrew Bible, John Levinson, on resurrection and the restoration of Israel. Christian hope is based on this fundamental Jewish and biblical hope, which Christians believe has been realized in the incarnation, passion, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, which I described last time, showing those slides of resurrection icons of the Heroin of Hell as a kind of divine rescue operation to liberate Adam and Eve, that is all of humanity, from captivity to sin and death. So nonetheless, and I think we talked about this together last time at the end of the talk, that there's a bit of a problem with our map of the afterlife. Because, of course, the main event is the resurrection. First of all, the resurrection of Christ, and then the resurrection of human beings in the age to come. So this question arises about why do we talk about going to heaven when we die? And is there a tension or a conflict between those two models? We talked about this a little bit, so I'm just going to pick it up and then slide into talking about the landscapes of heaven, hell, and purgatory. I'm sure you've run across the writings of N.T. Wright, the former Bishop of Durham, the great defender of a robust doctrine of the bodily resurrection. He wishes that we would stop talking about and singing all those hymns about going to heaven. And he's pointed out in his many books the fact that the early Christian community, which began as one among many communities in Second Temple Judaism, that shared a heightened sense of expectation, not of going to heaven, but of the new heavens and new earth prophesied by Isaiah. That is, of a new era in which the nations would be judged and the elect redeemed and Israel restored and God would dwell with his people. And this idea has to do, as N.T. Wright was always pointing out, primarily with the transformation of this world, rather than about travel to the celestial realm where God and the court of heaven reside. So sometimes we have a problem with kingdom of heaven language. I often feel when I'm teaching introductory courses at Smith that my students are picturing something like Disney's Magic Kingdom. That's not it. So N.T. Wright is great at pointing all that out. Despite that, though, we do have this rich catalog of images of heaven and this whole vast literature of longing for heaven in both Jewish and Christian traditions. And this is not a medieval corruption. It goes way back to the earliest authorities and witnesses of the faith. The liturgy of the temple, and for Christians, the liturgy of the Eucharist, really sets its sights on heaven, because in worship, the community is symbolically ascending to the heavenly Jerusalem, which is this realm of perpetual adoration and intercession for the needs of the world, where the angels are singing the Sanctus. We have one foot in the other world, even now on earth. And I think for Christians, this sense of heaven, the heavenly liturgy, this devotion to heaven, really comes from the same source as belief in the resurrection at the end of time. That is, this conviction that the ancient estrangement between heaven and earth had ended with the incarnation, passion, resurrection, and ascension of Christ. So as St. Paul says, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. And so Jesus tells the good thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. Of course, there's a lot of different ways to interpret that. I think N.T. Wright says it refers to this sort of temporary resting place, but it's still not a place of fulfillment of the eschatological hopes, the end time hopes. But the other thing is that in ascending to the Father 40 days after Easter Sunday, the tradition has held that Christ is really bringing humanity to heaven. In a sense, that's breaking the rules. There's a kind of divine decorum here, and it's being disturbed. What's humanity? What's human flesh doing in heaven? All the ancient authorities said, the flesh is for down here, and up there it should be just spirit. But Christ breaks that rule and makes a place for humanity in heaven. Maybe I'm pressing the metaphors too far, but that's how I look at it. So those who, through baptism and through faith, are members of Christ's mystical body, and I like to think of members in the literal sense, physical members, that is the church, the communion of saints, belong there now too. So maybe this is a new thing. And so it is fitting for Mary, the mother of Christ, to be taken up to heaven on some views without dying. There's great diversity of understanding of that within the history of Christian thought. And for Mary and the other saints to be able to intercede for the faithful who seek her protection. So Christian theology has traditionally taught that this is the case, and that communion with God, even before the resurrection at the end of time, is the end for which we were made, and that those who die in a state of grace and friendship with God are immediately, or perhaps after a period of purification, admitted to the bliss of heaven, where they become like God, as the first letter of John says, where they see God face to face, as First Corinthians says, where they see all things in God. This is the traditional understanding, and I'm not ready to jettison it, even if if there's a need for a corrective to an overemphasis, perhaps on pie in the sky when you die, something like that. The thing is that with the resurrection of the dead, this beatitude, this happiness will embrace, we're told, the entire person, body, soul, and spirit, and the renewed cosmos. So I think we have a situation where heaven, the beatific vision, that is the face-to-face vision of God, immediately after death for the elect or after a time of purification, that's perfect. Nothing is wanting. And yet, the risen life, the embodied life of the resurrection, is even perfecter, if you'll permit me that clumsy expression. That you have a kind of glory piled upon glory, so that the first glory doesn't take anything away from the last, and the last glory doesn't take anything away from the first. So, as Dean Harding was saying last time, it's not a zero-sum situation. And the entire Christian heritage of music and art and architecture and poetry, Dante, Gothic cathedrals, Bach cantatas, the metaphysical poets, the hymns of Charles Wesley, even the mythopoeic tales of Lewis and Tolkien, all of that has been an attempt to express with this torrent of imagery, this one great thing that our imagination actually can't comprehend. So the beatific vision, the wedding banquet, the crystal sea, the adoration of the Lamb, the heavenly liturgy, the world of light, all of these images, this whole torrent of images, we need them all. And yet they all fall short of comprehending a state that will be more wonderful than we dare to imagine, as Paul says, what no eye has seen nor ear heard, nor the heart of man conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him. Now, it's been pointed out, in particular by A History of Heaven written by Colleen McDaniel and Bernard Lang, that there's some pictures of heaven are strongly theocentric. They really picture the blessed as completely just caught up in this sort of rapture of adoration, and everything else falls away. And other pictures of heaven are sociable and anthropocentric. But what I've found is that the great, really great poets and painters and theologians of heaven, Dante, of course, towering above them all, paint a picture of heaven that is both theocentric and anthropocentric. So once again, we don't have a forced choice here. It's not an either or thing. There's an 11th century Irish vision in which the visionary who has an out-of-body near-death experience and gets to tour heaven, hell, and purgatory. When he's in heaven, what he sees is that the elect are standing with their faces facing God and their faces also facing one another. So you need extra faces for that. But that's the point, that there's the social dimension and there's the vertical dimension, and they're not in competition. So there's the social dimension is expressed by those images in the book of Revelation, the blessed multitudes adoring God in the city of splendor and the marriage feast of the Lamb and all of that. Another place where I see both of these, the theocentric and the anthropocentric, being beautifully represented is Frangelico's painting of the Last Judgment, where you see some saints are shown staring at God, gazing, I should say, not staring. While there's others who are doing kind of circle dance. They're not ignoring God any more than the ones who are gazing at God are ignoring their fellow saints. But it's both at once, and that's just hard for us to imagine. It's better than we could imagine. So I would say none of the authoritative early interpreters of the New Testament, and not Paul even, or the Pauline writings that are no longer attributed to Paul, none of the church fathers, none of the medieval doctors, none of the Anglican divines, none of this great cloud of witnesses before the 20th century have told us that we have to worry about choosing between longing to be with Christ and the saints in heaven after death and looking forward in hope and awe to the resurrection and the renewal of creation. It's just in modern times that I think we've lost sight of this both and situation. And that's partly because of new models of heaven that have come to be popularized. One is heaven is a kind of place of domesticity with your pets and all of that. And also the other one is heaven is a school where you have never-ending spiritual progress. And these models, at least in the popular form that we encounter, is they tend to be very individualistic and really emphasize the horizontal at the expense of the vertical. And so for that reason, I would like to just have us keep all the traditional pictures of heaven, even when they strike, especially when they strike us as counterintuitive or strange, so that they can teach us what our new models may be failing to help us realize. So that's a problem that I think we can solve. There's no competition there between the devotion to heaven and expectation of the resurrection. It's all resurrection based. But there is another problem about heaven, and that's the rumor that's gotten around that it's going to be boring, right? Endless church services. You know, how could you keep up an interest in all of that? Okay, that's easy to solve too, because heaven by definition can't be boring. Heaven has to be the best of everything. So if we think it's boring, we just got to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new image of heaven. The boredom is really in the eye of the beholder. So if we were to make it to heaven, if we were to have a share in the risen life of Christ, then one thing's for sure, we'll be remade into the kind of creatures who don't get bored. So much for that. We should be lucky to have such problems. The two other places that I want to speak about today, Purgatory and Hell, have problems of their own. So the problem with Purgatory is that Christians don't agree on it, and that it has been a church dividing issue. I'm going to suggest no longer is it a church dividing issue, properly understood. And in a time of what looks like decline in Christian participation, the last thing we need is a church dividing issue. So I think there's great ecumenical promise there to thinking about purgatory. And the other problem is, of course, the problem with hell. The problem with hell is that love can't bear it. So I see a solution for the problem of purgatory, but I'm not as confident in my thinking about hell. I'm very uneasy about the different solutions that are on offer. All of them, I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about going to purgatory. So one thing is that once you admit the possibility of a conscious interim period between the individual's death and the general resurrection, you have to think about, well, what's going to happen during that interim period? And this has been an issue for Judaism, for Christianity, and for Islam. They all have to contend with this. The idea of purgatory comes to mind in relation to this interim period. So what I want to do briefly is say some words in praise of purgatory and its ecumenical possibilities. In general, I would say purgatory has ecumenical possibilities because it's really a very pervasive idea. I've done a study of its analogs in other religious traditions like Buddhism. I would say that purgatory as a kind of general idea predates the specifically Christian and Roman Catholic doctrine of purgatory, and is tenacious. It tends to survive even when the doctrine is suppressed. One reason I think this is the case is that purgatory is a belief that's actually founded on a practice. I think maybe the practice comes before the belief, and that is the worldwide practice of caring for the dead with prayers, with rituals, with symbolic offerings. Because care for the dead, it's a practice, as you know, as I mentioned last time, goes back to our Neanderthal cousins and the Cro-Magnon and all that. It has really profound social consequences. I mean, otherwise you could just leave them lying around and, you know, let the vultures get them. Even traditions that do that have a kind of ritual for making that sacred. What Care for the Dead does is it knits together the human family. it's been called that, it's referred to, I forget who said this, that the dead are an additional age group that the living have to contend with, have to deal with. Care for the dead is really something that supports cultural continuity in times of change. It makes it the case that the ancestral traditions are passed on to rising generations. And it has implications for the way you think of the afterlife. It's very simple. If you do something to care for the dead, you're assuming, even if you don't think about it, there's a presupposition there that the dead are in a condition in which they can benefit from these ministrations, in a condition which admits of improvement. And if they're in a condition that admits of improvement, then they must be neither utterly lost nor perfectly fit for eternal blessedness. It's like I mentioned last time, William James saying that he's inclined to believe in immortality because he's not fit to live yet. He's an unfinished being. And for unfinished beings, a just cosmos will make provision, will provide a means to undergo correction and improvement, to satisfy old debts, to cleanse accumulated defilements, and to heal troubled memories. And that's what purgatory, and also its analogs in other religions, has the same function. That's what purgatory is all about. So some typical features in general of purgatory and its analogs in other religions is that there is this active interim state between the individual's death and a future life. If you're Buddhist or Hindu, that would be rebirth in another life. But let's say for the Western traditions, an active interim state between death and the final judgment, during which the dead suffer pains to pay off old debts or to purify and improve them. That's one feature. I'm going to mention two more. And the second one is a practice, as I mentioned, in which the living assist the dead by prayer, sacrifice, almsgiving, acts of generosity, food offerings, and ceremonies that are solemn or festive memorials of the dead. And also a sense in many cases that the dead can do something to help the living. The third, very interesting to me, very interesting feature of purgatory and its analogs in other religions is a certain kind of moral psychology. It's the idea that you can number sins, you can count them, you know what the sins are, you have a list of them. They can have specific penalties or remedies assigned to them. Now that sounds like a very unattractive moral psychology to modern ears. But I want to suggest that there's a definite advantage to this moral psychology. If you have a concrete list of sins and you know what the punishments are supposed to be, you can perform those penances, you can count those sins down and you can erase them one by one. In Dante's Purgatorio, the seven deadly sins are these P's for peccata on the forehead of Dante, and one by one they get erased as he experiences purgation, as he travels from one terrace to the next of purgatory, ending up in the earthly paradise at the end. So sins like this, on this understanding, can be counted down and erased. But our modern view of sin is more like just anxieties, and anxieties are infinite. You can be in therapy forever. The work is never done, not even in purgatory. And it's also a lot more expensive than even when you think in terms of the purchase of indulgences. It probably doesn't cost as much as old-fashioned psychoanalysis would cost. So those are some general observations about the sort of purgatory complex in world religions. I wish I could spend more time on that, but I want to move into the Christianity specific considerations. Okay, it's unbiblical. That is to say, we don't find explicit, spelled out teachings about purgatory in the Bible. Of course, neither do we find the Trinity spelled out. But purgatory is a little bit harder to find support for. Christians who believe in it do point to a few places in the Bible, to 2 Maccabees, which is in the Septuagint, but not the Hebrew canon, and it's not in Protestant Bibles, but Christians are aware of it anyway, whether or not they granted authorities, where you have the hero Judah Maccabee makes atonement for the idolatry of his fallen soldiers, deceased soldiers, by providing prayers and a monetary sin offering on their behalf. That's really part of that sort of purgatory complex, care for the dead, doing things on behalf of the dead. A few hints that people like to point to, they may be underwhelming, but in Matthew, truly I say to you, you'll never get out until you've paid the last farthing, suggests that you get a chance to pay the last farthing and then spring out of prison. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke, the words of Jesus from the cross to the good thief in Luke, those are also cited sometimes as evidence that there's this conscious interim period before the day of judgment, during which sinners may hope for some respite, and the blessed may preview their reward. And those who are kind of sinners but with some good in them, the mixed, can undergo correction. Also, the legend that the iconography of the Heroin of Hell represents, that on Holy Saturday, Christ invaded the realm of the dead and liberated Adam and Eve and the biblical patriarchs, and King David and all of the rest, has lent support in some eyes. Again, that's not biblical, but it's legendary, but it's provided a kind of imaginative support for the idea that there could be temporary realms of imprisonment and correction after death, followed by liberation. So it's not in the Bible, but I don't think it's an alien imposition either. One thing definitely to get right about purgatory is that it does not mean hell light. I think that's a common popular use of the term. Purgatory is used in just sort of a colloquial way, just to mean hell light. But in its original context, as it was articulated in the Middle Ages, in the medieval Christian West, not in the Orthodox world, but in Latin Christianity, and as it became a matter of Roman Catholic belief, which was formally defined at church councils in the Middle Ages and in the 15th and 16th centuries, purgatory refers specifically to the process by which those who die in a state of grace and friendship with God are made ready for heaven. So there's no trap door down to hell. Everybody in purgatory is already enrolled among the saints, has already been forgiven and absolved of the guilt for their sins, and all they need to do is complete the work of repair and experience the temporal punishment, the penances that are still owed, that make up what would in life have been normal acts of penance and restitution, if they'd had the chance to make good on those acts. And it's a chance to purify the faults and the sort of the character tics that would make heaven boring. John Henry Newman once said that, until we're holy, we can't be happy in heaven. So this is purgatory is an antechamber to heaven, and a place where people are prepared to be happy in heaven. No trapdoor to hell. So indulgences. Indulgences granted by the church, traditionally from the so-called treasury of merits, that is, the infinite merit of Christ and the merits of all the saints, can be applied to remit some or even all of this temporal punishment. And intercessory prayers, called suffrages by the living or by the saints to whom they appeal, can make this process of purification more fruitful and less severe. So there's a possibility of transfer of merit, which, again, putting on my world religions hat, it's a very common idea in many traditions, extremely important idea in Buddhism, that you can acquire merit and then transfer it to the account of your deceased family members. That's an important idea in Buddhism. It's an ideal, really. to acquire merit and dedicate it to the well-being of others who suffer. And that's a fundamental law of purgatory. So purgatory as a noun is a place name. People sometimes worry about place names. But the funny thing is about purgatory as a place is that nobody's ever figured out where it is. In fact, and not just modern thinkers, but Caesarius of Heisterbach, the 13th century Cistercian, said that he thought purgatory could be in several places at once. Purgatory actually begins in this life through suffering that it has a purifying effect. Some descriptions have purgatory on a mountain, some in the heavens, some underground, or in some non-spatial dimension. This gave Dante the creative freedom, actually, to place his purgatory far from hell. And this is a theological choice to make this point. It's not hell light. He placed it in the southern hemisphere on the 7-story mountain, from which Thomas Merton's memoir gets its title, that has the earthly paradise at its summit. So again, it's a pathway to heaven and not just a temporary hell. But it's more like a time than a place, because it does respond to this puzzle about the interim period between death and the final resurrection and judgment. And it seemed logical and almost irresistible to imagine that during this waiting period, if the dead aren't just asleep or just dead or unconscious, that they would spend that time in some way preparing for and previewing their final judgment. You know, in Islamic tradition, there's an idea that the dead are interrogated in the grave by these angels, and the blessed, those who will be favored at the resurrection at the end of time, for them, after they've answered all the questions correctly and professed their belief that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God and all that, a window opens up at the top of their grave, and they get to look out and see their future destination in the garden. Whereas the wicked get all the answers wrong, they can't do the profession of faith, they get a preview of their condemnation, and the grave narrows up and they get a window looking down to the fire, to hell. So this is kind of logical, actually, way to think about the interim period. And it results in a certain redundancy, which really creeps into Christian imagery of the afterlife. This idea that there's a preliminary judgment. Some people might say, well, if you've already been judged, why do you need a judgment at the end of time? But redundancy is the rule in these imaginative depictions of the afterlife. So this interim period, it's kind of a dress rehearsal for the last judgment. Again, we're not dealing with an either or situation, it's a both and situation. And so the imagery for the interim period is borrowed from ancient depictions of what would happen at the Last Judgment. Above all, the imagery of fire. Fire was a standard feature of Last Judgment descriptions in much ancient literature. Fire or judgment, it can have some really remarkable and interesting properties. It isn't always just an agent of punishment or destruction. In some of the ancient apocryphal literature, we hear about an intelligent fire that tests the souls and separates the wicked from the just, kind of like the sorting hat in Harry Potter. Tells you what school you belong to. We also hear about a purifying and refining fire. Zechariah in the Hebrew Bible speaks of a refining fire, and St. Paul mentions it as well in the first letter to the Corinthians. And there were some early Christian thinkers who believed that there would be a cleansing fire at the end of the world, the end of the age, that would bring about universal salvation. Everyone, even the demons, would pass through this fire and be cleansed and restored, and all sin burned off. In Zoroastrian traditions, it's molten metal, because fire was so sacred to them that it couldn't be even have this role, according to some Zoroastrian traditions. So, but in Christianity, the doctrine of universal salvation was rejected We'll see if that rejection stands when we get to talking about hell. But as a result of that, this refining fire was reserved for the reconciled sinner or the mixed to be the agent of their purification during the interim period after death. So that gives us our imagery for purgatory. So if you see these prayer cards or popular depictions of souls in purgatory, of course, the souls look like naked bodies because that's how we imagine persons. And they're in the flames and they're in a jail. It's Last Judgment imagery transferred to the interim period between death and Last Judgment. Now, there were rabbinic authorities who commented on Zechariah, and they said that the wicked would have to suffer in fire, that is in Gehenna, which gets translated in English as hell. But maybe, I don't know. Purgatory doesn't work for it either, but anyway, it's sort of like purgatory because they would suffer there for a full year. If they're wicked, then they would be obliterated at the end. So that's different from the Christian purgatory, but it's part of this larger realm of purgatory-like conceptions. And according to this rabbinic tradition, the deserving would be purified by this fire, but for as long as it took, but no more than 11 months. And then they would move on to paradise or some other wonderful place to await the resurrection and the world to come. And from that comes the belief that one should recite the mourner's Kaddish for one's parents during an 11-month mourning period rather than a full year. And the traditional belief is that merit from performing this pious work can be transferred to the dead, can shorten their time in Gehenna. So again, that's this characteristic idea about purgatory, that there can be transfer of merit as a really important aspect of the communion, the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead. So prayer for the dead and purgatory go hand in hand. So if you have a relative in those fires of purgatory, you can pray for that person and help to quench those flames. You can't do anything about the fires of hell as traditionally understood. The other interesting thing about this fire imagery is that fire is associated with angels, the burning seraphim, and with God as the consuming fire. So the great purgatory mystic of the Catholic tradition, the visionary Catherine of Genoa, I actually don't think she had a vision of purgatory, but she writes about it. And she says that the fire of purgatory is actually the fire of divine love, which burns away all the coarse parts of the soul until the soul is transformed into pure love. That's the way of thinking about purgatory, which is most attractive to people today, I think. So passing through purgatory, understood in this sense, far from being a kind of hell light, is actually part of the process of sanctification or deification. And that's, in fact, how Dante understands purgatory. So even though medieval purgatory lore looks very infernal, Dante at least grasped this idea that however burning and painful purgatory may be, what it's really about is being transformed, transhumanized, as he put it, transfigured. And so as he depicts it, the souls who are climbing up the terraces of Mount Purgatory are climbing back to their original blessedness. When they reach the earthly paradise at the top of Mount Purgatory, the image and likeness of God in the soul is restored. And this is the first stage of their deification, their theosis. So, and Dante also shows how much purgatory is really about prayer. You know, the living who pray for the souls in purgatory and ask the Blessed Virgin, all the saints to intercede for them. And the living can also pray to the souls in purgatory. Now, this is a unique situation. You don't pray for the souls in heaven. You don't pray for the souls in hell. You pray to the souls in heaven, but not for them. But in purgatory, you have both. This mutual kind of reciprocal prayer. The living can pray to the souls in purgatory and ask for their intercession, while they also pray for the souls and petition for them to have an easier time of it. So it's this wonderful kind of, purgatory is a kind of network hub for the exchange of intercessory signals, which is a really, to me, a very moving idea for thinking about the fellowship of all. So, of course, we know that the 16th century reformers took a very dim view of purgatory and of the associated intercessory practices and of the whole indulgences system. And so it was suppressed in lands where their viewpoint held sway. But my sense is that it had a way of surfacing under other names. So although communal ritualistic prayer for the dead had to go, it could be translated into acts of commemoration, which are so beautifully developed within Protestant traditions. The calculus of merits and penances, which I was speaking about as a kind of interesting, very different sort of moral psychology from the modern one, that had to go. But it could be translated into this sort of intense penitential interiority that is such a great hallmark of Protestant spirituality. Charity never went away, of course. It just got disengaged from purgatory and indulgences. Sanctification, of course, so central to Calvinist, to Methodist thought, took the place of the rejected Roman Catholic doctrine and became a kind of purified purgatory, with the emphasis that this is freely granted by the Savior, not purchased by penances. So purgatory then, especially in English literature, I feel like it became an underground stream, even a kind of a torrent with the Romantics, with Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and of course the Anglo-Catholic movement reclaimed purgatory and gave us the greatest purgatory poem of the 19th century, John Henry Newman's Dream of Gerontius, and gave us T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets full of purgatory imagery. It also, I think, gave rise to the English ghost story tradition. Medieval ghosts are, generally speaking, people from coming from purgatory who need to beg for suffrages. That's why they're unsettled. So even Charles Dickens' tale, A Christmas Carol, Jacob Marley looks like hell, but there's an element of penance in his visit to Scrooge. And if he's in hell, there's no penance possible. So I place him in a kind of purgatory by other names. The First World War was a watershed in thinking about purgatory. The idea had been brewing for some time, but with all the deaths and all the loss and not being able to even perform the rites for your deceased soldiers, young men who were lost, Anglican authorities made a proclamation sanctioning belief in an interim period of spiritual growth and purification for those whose lives were cut short. And they encouraged the faithful to pray for the dead. This was a big step beyond the 39 articles with its condemnation of purgatory. This was what made it possible and comfortable for a Protestant thinker, an ecumenical Protestant thinker like C.S. Lewis, to reclaim purgatory under its actual name. And I would say that some of the churches of the Reformation have followed in this train, have cautiously embraced what I would call a de-infernalized version of purgatory, focusing on this idea of sanctification or deification. In fact, the Lutheran Catholic dialogue that gave us that great declaration, joint declaration on justification by faith, had another meeting or a series of meetings which produced a text called The Hope of Eternal Life, in which these Lutherans and Catholics basically agree on this idea of purgatory, this de-infernalized version of purgatory, understanding it to be Christ's work and not something simply earned or bought. They agreed on that and decided this is not a church dividing issue. And the vision of purgatory that comes out of that document is essentially what one finds in recent Catholic teaching and goes back to Newman's Gerontius. It's very telling in the Dream of Gerontius. Maybe you've heard the Elgar version. Perhaps not as well known in this country as in the UK. But anyway, the soul of this deceased old man, Gerontius, isn't sent to purgatory. He prays to go to purgatory. He prays, take me away, and in the lowest deep, there let me be, and therein hope the lone night watches keep, told out for me. And he goes on like that. It says that sooner I may rise and go above and see him in the truth. Anyway, yeah, that's purgatory. So, the third thing was hell, going to hell. I hope not, but I'm running short on time here, and I just wanted to say something quickly about current debates, which I think are very familiar to people who would be tuning into this talk at all, about whether Christians are justified in believing in hell as something that has an end, as temporary, or that's empty or non-existent. It's worth wondering why the idea of an everlasting hell is so ingrained in Christian thought. Why is it a Christian distinctive? I think about Buddhist hells. They're actually more gruesome than any Christian hells you can find, but they're temporary. All realms of rebirth in Buddhism were temporary. The Jewish Gehenna is temporary. How is it that eternal hell became the majority view for Christians and also for Muslims, with exceptions actually, in both cases? I mean, it does seem that the hellfire preaching reflects a sense of urgency, a cosmic emergency, an apocalyptic eschatology in which powerful warnings are called for. That could be edifying, but is it edifying to think that that the saints in heaven will enjoy looking down at the sufferings of the souls in hell because it satisfies the demand of divine justice? That's hard to swallow. It is the case, though, that if you look at the Divine Comedy and you dropped the Inferno from it, purgatory and paradise by themselves would be weakened, would be blander because of that, I believe. So I don't know what to make of this. Recent approaches to the problem of hell is you have some people who say that, as C.S. Lewis puts it, hell is locked on the inside, that because of the great gift of free will, God had to allow for it to be possible for an individual to reject every offer of salvation. So that's the idea that hell is a self-condemnation rather than the older idea, which is that it's just retribution for the crimes you committed. You have the 20th century Swiss theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, who says Christians are obliged to hope for an empty hell. That would be a presumption to claim that we're certain of it. It is fortunate that there's no reverse canonization process. You don't have a list of people that are, are in hell. So you can entertain that kind of hope. And then most recently, the Orthodox theologian David Bentley Hart, he thinks that free will argument and that Balthasar hope approach really amount to nothing but a wretched compromise that leaves intact the problem that it portrays God as a vindictive brute. So that's where I leave us with those different alternatives to thinking about the problem of hell, to which I can't propose a solution, but which we might want to discuss. And I hope someone will enlighten us. If we're meant to be enlightened, maybe we're not meant to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a rich talk. On my word, there's an awful lot to dig in there, and I'm going to keep you for a few questions because it's just too rich. I mean, maybe we could take the last one, the last part first, which is the problem of hell, which love can't stand it, I think is what you said, and I think very, very often when you're talking with people who are considering whether they can embrace Christian belief or not, that the doctrine of hell is one of the things that troubles them, particularly in our time when exclusivity is to be excluded from anything is a real problem. I'll tell you that one of the things. So I mean, I guess I'm with Von Balthasar. I entertain a holy hope, but I'm sobered. I'm very sobered. Um, in the 19th, well, anyway, there was a liturgy that was in the Book of Common Prayer in the 19th century, the American Book of Common Prayer. It was a liturgy for a priest to use with a prisoner who was condemned to death. And I'm sorry that they took it out, because it was a very beautiful service. And actually, you didn't need to be a prisoner. You could be just anybody facing your death, and it would be a healthful series of prayers. But there are rubrics, and where the priest is given instruction. And one of the rubrics says, at this point, the priest is to cause the prisoner to consider that he should not despair of the mercy of God, nor presume upon his goodness. And this seems to me to kind of get at part of the trouble, that salvation is indeed a gift. It's a gratuitous gift. So it's nothing that we can earn, but likewise, it's nothing we have any right to. And to kind of demand that God must have to be governed by some sort of almost mechanical process that is exterior to him. He has to. Some people say he has to forgive. That's his business, I think. The other thing that kind of informs me in thinking about this, and I know you're quite familiar with C.S. Lewis, and I have to say that reading the Great Divorce was a real life-changing thing for me, and it changed my preaching, and it changed my whole view of the drama of salvation, and it personalized it for me, which was a thing that I was taught in seminary to dread, a kind of over personalizing or over individualizing, and I get that. I totally get that in every way. But for me, in a healthy way, it reintroduced the drama of salvation as about me and my soul. And what is so striking about how to describe that for people who have not read it? The Great Divorce. The divorce is being talked about as the divorce between heaven and hell.
Right.
And hell, C.S. Lewis envisions as a kind of gray suburban city, and there's a bus stop, and people get on the bus every day, and the bus climbs up to heaven, and they get out of the bus, and the grass hurts their feet because the grass is real and they're not, and so they're not material enough, which I think is just a wonderful thing. They're not, rather than heaven being very spiritual, the newly dead are not they're still so fleshy that they're not material enough for heaven, and you have to watch out for the rain, and they're wonderful things like that. But what happens then is that the saints come out and beg the people who have just come up from hell to heaven. The saints come out and beg these denizens of this. Well, is it purgatory? Is it hell? In Lewis's vision. And I kind of call it Dante for every man, what Lewis does with the Great Divorce, And the saints plead in the most heartbreaking way for these denizens of this infernal city not to get back on the bus and return. One that was very striking to me was, there's a bishop who comes up from hell, and his curate comes out and begs him to stay. But of course, he will have to repent of his heretical, and he says, "Oh, my dear boy, at the end of your life, you seem to talk as if heaven and hell were really actually real rather than metaphorical." And, we have this wonderful theological discussion group down in the gray city, and it's almost time for a meeting. I think I must go back. And, it's so this, so this is the dilemma. Well, can God turn every rebel home? Well, he's almighty, and the love is almighty, but yet we're free, and we have the spectacle in this life of those who will not say yes. To me, this is why Mary is so important, because she says yes and teaches us how to say
Right,
Uh,
right.
yeah. So anyway, those are just a few thoughts that I had about that. I wonder if that rings
Yeah,
a
yeah.
bell in any way.
I love that bishop in The Great Divorce. I remember he says, "Am I going to have a wider sphere for my usefulness here?" And
Right?
no,
You're of no use whatsoever.
you're not going to be useful at all. Isn't that wonderful? Yes, if only he could embrace that. And his progressive mission, is going. There's no room for it now. Yeah, it's wonderful, and of course, he's illustrating this free will theodicy, kind of this free will justification for the existence of hell. At the same time, um, it is interesting that these saints that come to meet the ghosts to give them a chance to become solid, to become real. We're all people that knew them in life. Like you said, it's the curate of the bishop. So that again, that reinforces that communion of the living and the dead, and the importance of the individuals
The
and their.
husband comes for the wife, and the son for the mother, and
Yeah. So that's important, but it's even so people can be intransigent even when their close friends and relatives are begging them to stay and to have this joy. So what's interesting is it's a little bit of a uh, twist or spin on the classical purgatory doctrine, because um, the ghosts. They're in the valley of the shadow of life, essentially, having left the gray town, which is the valley of the shadow of death. If they stay there, then the gray town will have become purgatory. But if they refuse every offer of salvation and are bent on going back to where they can be useful and have theological seminars in the gray town, it becomes hell and will have been hell even from the beginning. Um, the way he treats hell, though, is very interesting, because it turns out that this is the Platonism of C.S. Lewis. The Platonic idea of evil is that it's basically nothing. Everything that exists is good
right.
insofar as it exists. And Christians have certainly embraced this in relation to ideas of creation. So insofar as you're approaching this sort of vanishing point, which you can never arrive at, of absolute evil, um, hell is smaller than an atom of the real world. And so when the damned soul fits into hell, it's by being shrunk into almost nothing. So it's almost approaching another solution some people have proposed of annihilation, Christian mortalism, annihilation, as easier to swallow than the idea of torturing sinners for eternity. It's almost that, but it's not quite that. And so it's a wonderfully
Yeah.
tantalizing
Of course,
parallel.
in Dante's vision, everybody in hell is getting exactly what they wanted.
Mm,
The two lovers wanted to be carried away by a great love affair, and they sort of flap like sheets for all eternity. Kind of caught up in this lust, and is it the greedy that have the great big bags of stuff they have? That they
yes.
you
Yeah.
know. So, but the smallness, I thought, is also. I mean, I find actually Lewis's Platonism. I don't find that a critique. I find that a
No,
positive.
no. I,
But the shrinking, of the withering away, if God is the source of life, and turning away from God is already the beginning of hell, right?
yes. Right.
Then, can one imagine, and here we are, I think, with the sanctified imagination, can one imagine a turning which is so resolute and so complete, and of course, Milton has Satan say, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. The great evangelical Anglican John Stott, I mean, a very, kind of militant low churchman, and I'm not sure would be what he would think is to say about speaking to the dead and things like that. But he was what it was called what is it called a annihilationist.
Mhm.
You know,
Interesting.
Robert Jensen, the great Lutheran theologian, he writes about all this, and I think people who deeply ponder it say, well, here's the tradition, and this is the faith as we've received it. And it is full of tremendous hope and sober warning. And I think perhaps that's what we're meant to hold, you know, and
Yeah.
God will solve the problem for us. You know, he'll let us in on the story. But Robert Jensen says in when he's contemplating all these kind of different things, he says at the end of the day, the difference between an eternally consuming fire and annihilationism is hard to know what the cash value of that difference really is. So I think there is this theme in all kind of the visions of hell, a kind of privation, diminishment, withering away, a kind of and this is sort of Augustine's classic definition of sin is turning in upon yourself. And well, you've turned in upon yourself, and there's kind of less and less there, you know, in a way. And so I think it's I hope for myself, and I hope for everyone else. And I think, John Donne's, one of John Donne's poems is that he says, in paradise it is ever autumn, and the fruits are always in their season. And God does not say you should have come yesterday, but today is the day of salvation. So, I also like old gospel songs, and there's an old gospel song called "You're Drifting Too Far from the Shore," and the refrain is, "Come to Jesus today, let him show you the way. You're drifting too far from the shore." So I think that's probably where those are the kinds of thoughts that we need to stay with. And I think this prayer that was in this prayer book, which is neither to despair of the mercy of God nor to presume upon his goodness, but to be sober-minded about these things. And here's another way that I think about this, and I wonder what you would think about this. You know, for 8 years, I was a professor at a seminary. And, grading was the most horrible and awful part of the job as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
And everybody wants an A. And of course, you can give everybody an A. But it's not just. It's absolutely arbitrary if you do that. Now, here's the problem. If the student collects the A's and then applies to a graduate school and gets a spot with a really good doctor father or doctor mother, and the A's that they've gotten don't really reflect any kind of progress in the discipline, they've gotten the prize, but they can't do anything with it. And you're back to your sort of some of what you were saying about purgatory. I've been writing about this. I've said, imagine the music student who has neglected her scales and is suddenly given a lesson with a master of the violin. Well, you can't, and even a more common thing, which is a drama we see all the time. What does a bad man do with the love of a good woman, or a bad woman do with the love of a good man? And you see that, right? And sometimes that's a happy story, like the love is converting. It actually changes the person, and they're able to do something with it, and something very beautiful. But at other times, you see the love trodden underfoot. So I think when I was a little boy, hell was used to scare us into religion, and I think that's probably a mistake. But I also think that maybe we're not sober enough about the drama of salvation in our own time. That would be my thoughts there.
Yeah. I think, we're in a kind of wild time, an uncivilized time, if I want to be curmudgeonly about it, because we don't have absolutely clear moral maps to follow. And that makes us very anxious. Like I was saying, we think in terms of therapy rather than penance and forgiveness. So, we just want to throw ourselves on divine mercy because, to make a moral inventory is increasingly difficult for people when the moral guidelines keep changing or are invisible. I think that's part of the reason that we don't have that balance these days.
To talk about purgatory, is very interesting what you had to say about purgatory. And the Cathedral of All Saints is one of the early Anglo-Catholic congregations in the United States. And um, I think that one of the reasons the Anglo-Catholic movement really grew remarkably and was very powerful spiritually and theologically, and in terms of its capacity to produce holiness of life, particularly between the wars, and particularly right in the wake of World War I.
Mhm.
And I think one of the reasons for that was that a whole generation of English young men had been completely wiped out, and their mothers and their sisters, and the younger brothers, and the older fathers that were too old to fight themselves, they could go to the church and light a candle and pray in a requiem mass, and there was a tremendous pastoral consolation there. And I think I sort of wish there are some liturgical practices I kind of wish we could bring back. One is All Souls Day. If you go to a real Anglo-Catholic parish, they bring out the catafalque and the coffin, and death is present
Yeah.
in a way that I think liturgical reformers thought was, kind of anti-resurrection or something like that. But I
Mhm.
don't think so. I think it had a deep sort of pastoral psychological wisdom to it that maybe we ought to take a second look at.
Yeah. Well, since you have All Saints Cathedral, you should have an All Souls Chapel right next to it.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Um, I wanted to say a little bit about, you started out talking about N.T. Wright, and I'm a huge N.T. Wright fan. Actually,
Mm.
I've had the opportunity to meet the great man on a
Mhm.
couple of occasions. I've been a chaplain at a conference where he was one of the speakers, and I so admire his book on the resurrection. I went to Yale, went to a conference at Yale University when his trilogy on the resurrection was first coming out, and it, of course, absolutely blew out of the water the idea that the disciples were using the word resurrection in some sort of metaphorical or
Yeah.
spiritual, or I mean, they meant something very this worldly about by it. And he was giving these lectures, and there were all these retired congregational ministers there, and they were whispering to each other. I always knew it was real. I always knew it was like he gave Christian clergy, like the mainline clergy, the permission to come out of the closet and reveal that they actually believed in the creed
Oh,
all these
wonderful.
years, and they weren't sort of deficient in their intellect because they only took the resurrection to be kind of a metaphor of some kind of vague spirituality. So I admire him in every way, but I'm bemused by his attack on heaven, I have to say. I think it's I'm bemused by it. I get it to some degree because um, um, I don't think they're actually pagan ideas of heaven, like that you would get from, let's say, the Latin and Greek classics, but kind of sort of a popular Valhalla or something like that, so that grandfather is playing pinochle. He loved pinochle, so he's playing pinochle for all eternity, or
Right.
playing
These are
golf,
modern. Right. These are
right?
modern
Which is
ideas.
really a vision of hell if you think about it very, 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 very hard. But the biblical heaven, I mean, heaven is all over the Bible.
Mhm.
I think, doctor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a lot about heaven in the Bible. And Robert, again, one of my heroes, Robert Jensen, the Lutheran theologian, points out the biblical heaven is close. It's not far away. It's not unrelated to this world. It bears in upon this world.
Mhm.
And there are these gates of heaven. And Jacob lays his head on the pillow, and the angels go up and down and take off the shoes from upon your feet. And surely this is the gate of heaven. And Stephen is being stoned, and the heavens open, and John is in exile on the island, and the heavens open, and he sees the real worship that is going on in heaven. And heaven is also the place where the prayer is going up, the longing prayer is going up for the redemption of this world and the recreation of this world, because the martyrs underneath the altar are crying, how long, O Lord, Maranatha, Maranatha, right? So I have to say I'm quite confused by I sort of get it in a way, but I think it's a bit overdone, and
Yeah,
I really don't think our pastoral theological problem in the last part of the 20th century, first part of the 21st, I don't think our problem is too much too much of a vertical emphasis and not enough of a horizontal emphasis. I don't think that's the problem. I think quite the
right.
opposite is the case. So, you know,
Right. I think, it's a corrective that is needed at certain eras. So, for instance, in the early period of the Reform Judaism movement, they decided that resurrection was kind of a crude
right,
idea. So they
right.
dropped it and said we should just talk about immortality of the soul and going to heaven.
An
Um,
oddly anti-Semitic
that
thing to
that died
do.
out, and now they use all the traditional, even the Reform congregations are using the traditional language again. It was a temporary insanity, and I think maybe N.T. Wright worries that that's still something that's affecting us. Plus the kind of sentimentalized, highly individualistic, new agey sort of views of heaven that are around, and that maybe he encountered a lot in a pastoral context that he worries about. But sometimes it sounds almost like the Marxist critique, that will
Yeah,
neglect
I know. Yeah.
the needs of those around
Well,
us if we believe in heaven. But it doesn't seem to work that way.
this
So
this could lead to a dangerous discussion about British academic politics. We won't.
I don't know enough
Won't
about
go,
it.
won't go there. One just final thought, which was I was very, so I mean, I think there is as you pointed out, there's now, there was an Anglican declaration kind of giving permission, was an advance, which was a, a what would you say it, um, an amplification of the 39 articles, the famous Reformation articles of the English Church, really the Anglo-Catholic movement. This was something that was part of the popular piety, but it was really kind of strictly speaking, not according to the articles. And so this was a real shift in kind of the ethos of Anglicanism, and pretty significant one. I thought so, but there's still bound to be tension over this doctrine and over this issue. But one of the things that I thought as I was listening to you talk really closes the gap between evangelicals and Roman Catholics and somebody like C.S. Lewis or somebody like me who thinks that you know if I were to die today, I'd have to say, clean up on aisle 3. There's something still needs to be done here before we're ready for to be presented to the King. Um, um, but you bring out so strongly that the soul that in the best understanding of the tradition, as it describes this process of purgation, which it seems like inevitably you get some kind of process of purgation somewhere along the line. Something has to happen so that um, we not only are treated by God as though we are holy, but we actually become, in some real way, we really take on the holiness of Christ, and are conformed into Him, and therefore, where He's prepared a place for us, there we can be with Him as well. But you point out that all the souls in purgatory, their salvation is already assured.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that closes the gap, because that's one of the evangelical issues,
Right.
is the assurance of the conversion of faith, the assurance of personal faith, the certainty of things not seen, and so on. I mean, in the language of Hebrews, and so the assurance of salvation, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine, oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Somebody could sing that song, and it wouldn't really contradict in any way the doctrine of purgatory as you've laid it out.
Yeah, and I think it helps that on the Roman Catholic side, that this de-infernalizing process has gone as far as you could possibly imagine with the catechetical statements of John Paul II, the Catechism, and especially Pope Benedict XVI his encyclical on hope, Spe Salvi, has a beautiful, just a couple paragraphs, I think, on purgatory, but it's completely, it should please any evangelical who reads it, and nothing, I think, would deter agreement. It's also just beautiful prose.
Yeah, I think one of the things, I mean, I'm very committed to ecumenical work, and it's one of the, it's a joy of being dean of this cathedral, is this partnership between these two cathedrals. I taught for 8 years at a seminary that was more in the evangelical tradition of Anglicanism, and one of the documents that I taught was John Paul II, The Beauty of Reason. And I would teach that document, and because it's just a great document about ethics, about natural law and ethics, and the students often who were coming kind of out of the megachurch world or something like that, and they've discovered C.S. Lewis, and they wanted to be the same religion as C.S. Lewis, but they would ask me, if the author was really, Professor, you're saying that the author of this is a Catholic. I find that hard to believe. Are you really sure?
Oh, Catholic.
So yeah, that was really the question. Is so a lot of these differences are inherited, more of a matter of inherited polemics than they are of actual examination of the real things that are being taught by the churches. And anyway, we're so grateful to you to come to us and be part of this. We hope a series that will be ongoing, where the two cathedrals will bring to Albany a Christian teacher who can teach about a very basic element of the Christian faith, and nothing, I think, is more foundational and significant than the hope of the resurrection of the body and the life of the world to come. So I'm very grateful to you, Dr. Zaleski.
Thank you. It's been a joy conversing with you and being part of this whole series. It's a great pleasure and honor. Thank you.
We'll have to get you to come back. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you.